that stands for the crew hands-off point. And this is literally just the point where the crew will not be sending any commands to the vehicle. It's all over to Dragon if any aborts need to be called, just due to the latency with the flight computer responding to crew actions at that point. And then we'll stand by for the contact and capture. Again, we were tracking
SpaceX Dragon from the PLT, comm check. Dragon to ground.
I hear you loud and clear. Help me.
Loud and clear, Anna, and Doug and I have a good intercom check as well.
Copy. Good intercom checks. Let us know when you are done with that full suit donning procedure, and we'll bring you into suit leak checks.
So Bob Benkin hopping on the comms there. He used the acronym, or I guess the letters PLT for pilot.
Okay, we're donning our gloves at this time.
We copy.
So for ISS missions for NASA, there are 4 seats in the Dragon spacecraft. If you were looking in from the side hatch, it would be seat 1 on the far right, all the way counting up to seat 4 on the far left. Doug Hurley in the commander or CDR seat, that's seat number 2. So it would be the second seat from the window.
Right.
Yeah, second from the right.
It goes backwards from the way we're normally taught to read. And so it is a little bit confusing when you're looking at it. Unless you're in the crew's point of view, and then it makes sense because you're going left to right, 1 to 4.
And Bob Benkin in the pilot seat right next to him. It's second from the left. And in front of them are those 3 displays and the button panel that we got a chance to see earlier that they'll be monitoring telemetry on and using to exercise that manual piloting test.
And it looks like the crew just has a couple of steps left until they're done getting into their suits, and then they'll go ahead and do another leak check. This will be the 3rd leak check they've done in these suits since their day started yesterday. They did an initial one when they got suited up in the operations and checkout facility down on the ground in Kennedy Space Center.
SpaceX Dragon, I'm Dragon to ground. We're complete with 4.010.
Copy. Complete with 4.010 for suit donning. At this point, you are go to begin your suit leak check procedure.
We'll put 4.011 in work.
And so with that, the crew are going to step into leak checks again. This is going to be their 3rd one. They've already done one when they initially got suited up in the operations and checkout facility, another one once they climbed into Dragon when it was still on the pad and connected their suits via umbilical to the seats in the Dragon spacecraft.
SpaceX Dragon in 2.2, we are ready to pressurize.
And Dragon SpaceX on Dragon to ground, you are go to pressurize.
Okay, visors are down. We'll put that in work.
So now the crew going to step through and pressurize. Normally when the suits aren't pressurized, they can keep one of the zippers kind of just cracked open, and they're able to just flow cabin air through the spacesuit itself just to provide some cooling while they're inside. We can either flow nitrox into the suits. You could do that if you had a contaminated environment on board the Dragon spacecraft. It's something we also look for on the space station, and they had some air samplers out a little bit earlier just looking for any trace contaminants in their breathing atmosphere. The suits also can have pure oxygen flown to them or flowed to them should the cabin itself depressurize. That'll happen below a certain PSI threshold as we don't pressurize the suit all the way up to 14.7 psi if we're in a depressurized environment. Otherwise, you would be in essentially a pretty big balloon, and it'd be really hard to move. So they pressurize it to a much lower threshold, and just to make up for the lack of oxygen, therefore in a lower density air, you'd be flowing them pure oxygen. So those suits just serving as another barrier protection for the crew for anything like a contaminated atmosphere or a depressurized cabin inside Dragon. But crew suited up now. Sounds like we're about to step through these leak checks.
Yeah, and we were talking a little bit there. So as you're listening to comms, there's some call outs for 4.010 and 4.011. Those are referring to procedures that the crew have on the spacecraft. So they have procedures built into their displays. These two just happen to be the two that they're running right now. They also have those on their tablets, so they can follow along there if they needed to. We were also talking a little bit about 14.7 psi. I know you and I both have engineering backgrounds, but if you don't have an engineering background, the atmospheric pressure at roughly sea level, sometimes referred to as 1 atmosphere, is roughly about 14.68 to 14.7 psi. So if you're at sea level right now or pretty close to, what you're walking around in is 14 pounds per square inch of force about on your body. And that's roughly what the Dragon capsule is also at when they're flying up.
And while those leak checks are in work, the station itself is in the docking attitude. We get to do a pretty cool thing with station during the docking of the Crew Dragon. Normally, the station's attitude, or which way it's pointing, is controlled by these very large gyroscopes called control moment gyros. And it's a pretty efficient way, only using electricity, to keep these large gyros spinning, pointing in opposite directions to help stabilize the station. It's a very large spacecraft, so using thrusters a little more work intensive. We actually switch over to the Russian thrusters during the initial docking of the Dragon spacecraft, and then after that...
SpaceX Dragon on Dragon to ground, we saw 2 good leak checks.
And Dragon SpaceX on Dragon to ground, we saw the same. Great news, thanks.
And we just got confirmation 2 good leak checks on those suits, so another milestone down as they continue their approach. But just to finish that thought, we're on Russian thrusters right now, controlling the attitude on board the space station. We'll flip over back to the control moment gyros, so those are over on the U.S. segment once we make that initial soft capture, just because we don't want, during that final pull-in of that soft capture ring before we get to that ready to latch, the thruster controls of the attitude can be a little bit more jarring, so we switch back over to the control moment gyros and then let Dragon resume its hard mate. But all that coming up in just about 2 hours, hopefully, away from our targeted docking time, right around 7:30 a.m. Pacific here in Hawthorne. But everything continuing to go well. We have that approach initiation burn happen about 16 minutes ahead of schedule. In just under 8 minutes from now, we'll do our mid-course burn, and then we're standing by for that arrival at waypoint 0 in just under 28 minutes from now.
Now on your screen is a view of the Dragon spacecraft from the International Space Station. We're on the sunlit side of the Earth, so daytime for those folks, middle of the day, I'm sure. Right now, actually, Dragon is just about to fly over the Caspian Sea. So if the clouds sort of break a little bit, we might get some cool views of planet Earth behind us. You know, once that suit leak check is complete, Bob and Doug might pop open their visors. Those can come open for their comfort. So we may hear some calls about that coming up here.
Right now, Dragon just continuing to close its way in. Right now we're about 2.5 kilometers away from the station, so just a little over 1.5 miles, closing in at a rate of about 3 meters per second, or about 6.7 miles per hour. The Kronos flight controller over in Houston, controlling this camera outside the station. He's controlling it from that mission control center on the ground, giving us a nice zoomed out view as the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station actually just flying over Kazakhstan. They are a few hundred miles to the west right now of Baikonur, which until yesterday has been the only gateway to orbit for our U.S. crew members to the International Space Station. So they're going to make a pass just to the north of Baikonur. We're looking at